Well, we're on a subject we've been looking at these last few weeks on the 7 signs in the Gospel of John. As we've explained over these past few weeks, the first part of John's Gospel, chapters 1 to 12, are written around 7 signs. Now, when you look at John's Gospel, these signs appear to be miracles. But as we dig down into it, we see that John's trying to point out various things about Jesus' mission in the form of signs that he is God's Son, the promised Messiah. So we're on, there's 7 signs there which are up there. The turning the water into wine, healing the official's son, making the lame walk, Jesus walking on water, feeding the multitudes. And this one is about giving sight to the blind. So that's what we're looking at, the 6th sign, healing of the man born blind. He wasn't born blind, this man. When he was born, he was blind. So let's just remind ourselves of the text of this. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man who had been blind since birth. Jesus' disciples asked him, "Teacher, why was this man born blind? Was it because he or his parents sinned?" "No, it wasn't," Jesus answered. "Because of his blindness, you will see God work a miracle for him. As long as it's day, we must do the one who sent me wants me to do. When night comes, no one can work. While I am in the world," Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." After Jesus said this, he spit on the ground, he made some mud and smeared it on the man's eyes. When he said go, then he said, "Go and wash off the mud in Siloam pool." The man went and washed in Siloam, which means one who is sent. When he had washed off the mud, he could see. The man's neighbours and the people who had seen him begging wondered if he could really be the same man. Some of them said he was the same beggar, while others said he only looked like him. But he told them, "I am that man." "Then how can you see?" they asked. He answered, "Someone named Jesus made some mud and smeared it on my eyes. He told me to go and wash it off in Siloam pool. When I did, I could see." "Where is he now?" they asked. "I don't know," he answered. So this sign reveals that Jesus is the light of the world. Remember, Jesus at this time is in Jerusalem. He's going to attend the Feast of Tabernacles, and he meets this man, or comes across this man, who has been blind by birth. And so the disciples ask him this question about, was it he who sinned, or was it his parents who sinned? "Teacher, was this man born blind?" Teacher, why was this man born blind? Was it because his parents had sinned? They query this. Why did they query? Because deep down in Jewish history and law, there was a couple of phrases in the time of Moses that indicated that if people sinned, that sin would be passed on from generation to generation. And it appears in a couple of places, but mainly in Exodus 20 verse 5, which is in one of the commandments, and in Exodus 34:7. It says, "Does he, God, does not leave the guilty unpunished He punishes the children and their children for the sin of their fathers to the third and fourth generation. And so it was commonly thought in Jewish theology that people who had illnesses must have sinned, although this wasn't true. This saying came up in the fifth commandment about loving your parents, etc. And it was a specific to that generation of Moses, yet got passed on, and people thought that was the reason for it. But Jesus firmly scotches that idea when he comes to heal this man. No, it wasn't, Jesus says firmly. But because of his blindness, you will see God work a miracle in him. So this poses another question. Was this man made blind by God so that Jesus could later heal him? And of course the answer to that is no. God does not inflict pain on people just to prove a point. God had not made the man blind in order to show his glory. Rather, God has sent Jesus into the world to do works of healing in order to show his glory, in order that God's glory could be revealed. And that's the way we must look at it. It can't it, be a bit confusing? You could think, well, has this man purposely been born blind so when Jesus meets him later on in his mission, he can heal him? No. In fact, if we look at it, blindness was one of the most commonest diseases in the ancient Near East. At that time in world culture, lots of people were blind for all sorts of reasons. It was just one of those things. Our eyes, we know, need to be carefully looked after, don't we? They need to be washed in clean, healthy water. And we know that often water in that period, those years ago, wasn't good. It contained all sorts of bacteria that we wouldn't find in water these days. So consequently, blindness was quite common. And in fact, there are many parts of the Gospels that we see where Jesus heals blind people. He heals blind people more than he does any other sickness. When Jesus heals the man, John clearly intends us to see the actions as one of the moments in the Gospels when God's truth and the world's life come rushing together into one. This is what's happening here in this story. The other strange thing about this, of course, is that Jesus picks up some dirt and puts it in his hands, spits on it, makes some mud and put this over his eyes. Well, this doesn't sound too good, does it? When we're talking about, the need to make sure we look after our eyes, putting dirt that people have walked on over many months, etc. Why did Jesus do this? Well, and strangely again, it wasn't the only time that Jesus did this. He did it several times. We don't know the reason why. Was it just was it an easy way for him to wash his eyes and therefore clear his eyes? We don't know. But he was sent to the pool of Siloam after this. Jesus had speared this mud on and told to wash his face, wash his eyes, and then he would see. The pool of Siloam means sent in Hebrew. And it's a special pool. This pool has been the water source for Jerusalem right from the beginning of its occupancy. And that's the reason why people could live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was on a hill. Water doesn't flow up hills, does it? But this pool enabled the city to be built, and they had a fresh water supply because there was a pool that came out of the rock halfway up the hill. The pool of Siloam. And of course later on, Hezekiah digged out a tunnel, some, I think, was it half a mile long, in which it enabled the city to draw more water to. And if you go to Jerusalem today, that's one of the things you want to do, is to walk through Hezekiah's tunnel, this tunnel that was dug out 3,000 years ago, just with hand tools. Quite amazing. Strangely enough, let me recommend a programme that you can get now when you get on iPlayer. It's called Jerusalem, the Making of the Holy City. And I can't remember who is by, but who's doing it now?
Martin knows. We watched that film.
You watched it, did you? Because I mentioned it on Wednesday.
You knew the man that was narrating it.
Yes.
Oh yeah, Simon Sebag.
Yes, Simon Sebag Montefiore.
Yeah.
Sounds a funny name, doesn't it? But he's done a couple of things on television. But he's done this series, and the first one, which is only, I think, available for about another day or two, deals with the very beginnings of Jerusalem. And it talks about the specialness of this Siloam pool here, and how it became a very spiritual place. And it's because of the pool and the spiritual place, because it all goes back to the time of Melchizedek, who came from Siloam. It comes back there to this special place, and that's why the city was built. So I recommend that. It was quite good, that. It goes through the various stages of how Jerusalem keeps on being invaded and taken over by the different faiths, one after another, and then they come back and go again, right up to the current day. So it's quite an interesting programme. I recommend it to you. And so the blind man, if you went, is being told, once this mud is put on his eyes, to go and wash in the place called Sent, by the one who was sent by God, which is quite interesting, isn't it? The sign, we might say. The man who once lived in darkness now lives in the light. Light both in eye and heart. So, as we look at this, we look that Jesus is very much into healing people who are blind. Another quote from N.T. Wright. At the start of the book of Genesis, God was faced with chaos. He didn't waste time describing the chaos, analysing it, or discussing whose fault it was. Instead, he created light, and following the light, a whole new world was created. So there's a connection here between the opening books of the Bible about light and Jesus being the light of the world, and he coming to allow people who are blind are to see. Not just physically blind to see, but more importantly, spiritually blind to see. Creating light out of chaos. Right. I played the rest of that incident because I want to point out the fact of this. I once was blind, but now I see. And we need to look at the text that so we can make sure what we do. We see, so of the instant, I want to think. So what happened? The man goes to the synagogue and he's recognised that he was blind and now he can see. And of course the Pharisees, and that's the leaders, the religious leaders at the time, start to question him because they've already heard of this Jesus and were not very happy with the way he is teaching and what he's saying. So you hear him question that on the trial. And they can't accept that Jesus is somebody who's sent from God, let alone to be the Messiah, the Saviour of the world. They just cannot fathom it because their eyes are blind. They are blind because they've got no real relationship with God. It's only when we've got a relationship with God that we see what God is doing in the world. And the reason I've gone on with this story a bit is the fact that it illustrates that this is one of the very few instances when Jesus healed somebody and they became his follower forever, if you like. We see in here that, Jesus asked him, do you have faith in the Son of Man? And first of all, he replies, Sir, you tell me who he is, and I will put my faith in him. And then when you saw that on the thing, Jesus says, well, it's me. I am the Saviour of the world. I am the Son of Man, which he would understand to be the Messiah. He responds with, Lord, I put my faith in you. And he kneels down before God. Who else does that remind you of? That was confronted with Jesus and then calls him Lord and falls on his knees. Thomas, quite correct. This is a conversion. This man has has been ill, has been healed. He's wandered around telling everybody. The synagogue hears. They question him on 2 occasions. And you see on the second interrogation, he's quite indignant with the way he's being questioned, isn't he? He starts also to challenge the Pharisees about who Jesus is. And he stands up and challenges him. And he said, well, I'm blind. Now I see. If you don't understand that that's a miracle, then there's something wrong with you. Which I think is quite good. Another quote from N.T. Wright. Jesus' presence divides the world into those who come to the light and allow it to change, heal and direct their lives, and those who resist the light and choose to remain in darkness, even while, in some cases, declaring boldly that they can see everything clearly. So this chapter about the blind man, born blind, comes to its conclusion with Jesus challenging again the Pharisees, the leaders of the people who are supposed to guard the people spiritually. They cannot see the truth of the scriptures portraying that Jesus is the Son of Man. And Jesus says to them, isn't it? Basically, you are guilty. You wouldn't be guilty if you didn't know the scriptures so well. He's challenging them, the fact that they are sinful because of all the study, all the discussions, all their heritage has not led them to see and identify Jesus as the Son of Man. They don't want to see it. And the reason is quite solely because they've got all the power and the authority, and they don't want to lose it to somebody else who God has sent. And he says, therefore, Jesus challenges them that they're still in sin because they're not ignorant of the work of God. I think it's very interesting. We sang that lovely song, didn't we, to start off with, of John Newton. And I've got a clip of John Newton here. It's a story of slavery, how it took William Wilberforce virtually 40 years to convince Parliament that slavery was wrong. He came year after year presenting bills to abolish slavery, and it got defeated, mainly because the people in power couldn't see the truth that slavery was an abomination to the world, to God. It took time, and eventually after 40 years, the votes, his first vote, he got 16 people voted out of the Parliament, I think about 300 seats there, just for the abolishment of slavery. Gradually, the number of people who voted went up and up and up. And it was people like John Newton who come back, and at this point in the story, he then writes basically a book of his life and how he came to see slavery as wrong and how he gave things to God. It's one of the final documents presented to Parliament that persuaded the MPs to vote for. And in the end, I think it was exactly only 16 people voted against the abolishment of slavery out of the 300 or so, or very near that amount. I can't be sure, but and this is what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. They are the theologians of the time, the religious leaders who rejected Jesus, and they rejected Jesus solely because they couldn't see through their blindness. And that is what happens when we become and give ourselves to Jesus. In many ways, we see things we never see before. We see the beauty of the earth. We see God at work in the world. And we don't see that thing. We tend to think nobody believes in God at all. We tend to believe that nobody's interested in the message of the gospel. Yet once we give our lives to Christ and call him Lord, everything changes. Jesus is the light of the world because he brings light into our world. Well, one more sign to do, but that will be after I take my break.